Yeah, it's on. Okay. All right. All right. I think we're going to get, hold on. I'm going to fix this audio issue. Hello? Okay. Can you help me with the audio problem? It's doing that same echo thing.
Volume down?
Yeah, I just turned it off. No, no, we don't have that. Yes.
Here's Zoom.
I just can't give a presentation with that again.
Well, if your volume is down, you should just try again.
Testing.
Your volume is.
Testing. Are we good? Okay. Do I need to press resume? Resume share?
Yep. And then full screen.
All right. Welcome to our third public meeting for the Midtown Thriving project. I'm Kate Stryker. I'm the project manager for the consultant team on this project, which is Pattern for Progress. And before we get into the meeting, I just want to make an announcement that we are offering Spanish language interpretation services with Rocio Sharok. And those services are for the in-person audience. So our agenda for the day is we're going to spend 5 minutes giving a quick project overview and refresher. We're going to spend about 10 minutes going through some key findings from our neighborhood analysis. And then we're going to spend the bulk of our time hearing about what we've been doing as far as community input, a sort of summary of findings from all the community input, and going through the results of our public survey, which closed a couple of weeks ago. And then we'll spend the remainder of time answering questions. Briefly, the project team includes Bartek Stardai from the city. Susan Landfried is with the Department of State. They are the organization that is providing the grant for this planning project. And then the team at Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress, which includes Adam Bosch, Elke Godfried, who's here with me tonight and will be presenting, Eric Pearson, I'm Kate Stryker, Robin DeGroe, and Yasmin Aziz. So quickly, what is this project? I think many of you here tonight are familiar with this project already, but briefly, it's a community-driven plan to guide the redevelopment of vacant or underutilized sites in Midtown. It will also serve as a master plan for the neighborhood. And it is driven by community vision and input. The process involves identifying the needs and desires of Midtown's diverse residents and small businesses and prioritizing those needs through policy and planning strategy and tools. We are wrapping up the first phase of this planning process. We've been, as I mentioned, collecting data out in the community, hearing from the community in various ways. This is all coming together to finalize a vision and the existing conditions and inventory analysis. And we have also been selecting the select sites. Starting next year, in January, we're going to really be working with the community to plan what should go on those sites and also to work on developing recommendations in response to the analysis of all the input that we've gotten. So you're going to be hearing about that tonight. That gets all put together into a report. By May of next year, we'll be starting to put together that draft and finalizing it, presenting it to the public for feedback towards the end of the summer, and then spending the fall sort of editing the plan based on input and submitting it to the state for designation. So just a few key findings. This is not a comprehensive list of findings by any means, but one of the needs, you may not be surprised, that has sort of elevated itself in just the data. We're just looking at the data right now, is that housing is a challenge for people in this neighborhood. So since 2010 in the city of Kingston, housing costs for renters increased by 30%, whereas inflation-adjusted household income for renters increased by just 3%. Housing costs for homeowners increased by 10%, and inflation-adjusted household income for homeowners decreased by 1%, and that's between 2010 and 2022. This is another measure of housing cost burden, of housing needs in the city. So this is a measure called housing cost burden. This is what the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development uses to kind of measure affordability in communities. So according to HUD, housing is affordable if housing costs are less than 30% of the total household income. That's regardless of income and regardless of cost. So it's a percentage of household income. A household is considered cost burden if those housing costs are between 30 and 50%, and then they're considered severely cost burden if it's more than 50%. Here in the city of Kingston, 60% of households live in housing, which is considered affordable to them based on that metric. And 20% are cost burden and 20% are severely cost burden, meaning 20% of Kingston's households are paying 50% or more of their income towards housing. This further breaks that down to renters and household homeowners, and you can see that about 50% of renters are living in housing that's considered affordable to them, but 24% are living in housing that's they're paying more than 30%, and 24% are actually severely cost burdened. So this data is not available at the neighborhood level. This data is only available at the city. So this isn't specific to the city, this specific data point. Another sort of key finding is that much of the housing stock in Kingston is old. 93% of housing units were built in 1980 or earlier, and 50% were built before 1940. And while we love old housing, it's beautiful, it's charming, and it's oftentimes built better than new housing, some would argue, it does typically have higher maintenance and operating costs. It's more expensive to heat older houses, and it also oftentimes contains hazardous materials like lead paint or asbestos. And so keep that in mind when we look at within the study area, the BOA study area, 92% of the housing units were built before 1980, which is similar to the city at large, but 70% of housing units were built before 1940. And approximately half of all the housing units in Kingston built before 1940 are in the BOA study area. So here's a map where you're seeing first the actual study area itself, which is the Midtown neighborhood, as we defined it for this project. And this is showing access to food stores. And you can see there are several food stores in Midtown. However, they're not full grocery stores. And I think you're all aware that the only full grocery store in the city is in the Kingston Plaza. And this map is showing the walk time to get to that grocery store. So the purple blob shape around that green dot is a 10-minute walk. And the green blob shape is a 20-minute walk. And you can see much of Midtown is outside of that 20-minute walk. Another early key finding is that there's a significant number of parking lots. So first of all, that first series of data points are really about community access to resources. And these next data points are really about the land itself and the built environment, the health of the land. And that is in our final report, that'll be how we've sort of done the analysis. So this slide is showing that there are a significant number of parking lots and vacant properties in Midtown, which for this project is a significant finding. We are actively working with Bartech from the city to hone in on a list of 8 to 10 select sites, as I mentioned, that'll be the focus of the next phase of this project. And some of those sites are on this map. There is a limited amount of publicly owned land in Midtown. Most of the publicly owned land is accounted for as a park, a trail, a post office, a school, but there's a few parcels, and those are in our list of sites that we're considering. There's also a limited amount of parks and open space in the study area. As you can see on this map, the green indicates the park space. Oops, wrong direction. And then this map is showing the different modes of transportation and transportation infrastructure that's available in Midtown. And I mean, you're probably all aware, but I think it's worth highlighting here that Midtown is pretty well served by a combination of rail, pedestrian, bike, and vehicular infrastructure. And it's important to note that there's sort of different state versus local management of some of those roads, which does impact sort of how they are planned for and managed. As part of our existing conditions, we're also wrapping up our market analysis for the neighborhood. And these are just a few of the key findings. There is a persistent demand for diverse types of housing in the Kingston area and in the neighborhood. The rise of remote work is really sort of shifting the local housing needs and economy. And it can make it difficult actually to predict what a market like Kingston will need. But it is, just gonna move on. Retail vacancy rates in Kingston area are 2.8%, which is relatively low, which indicates that there's a need for more retail space. Kingston office space rents are about $24 per square foot, which is 1/3 of the national average. And industrial space rents in Kingston are lower than the national average. The sale price per square foot for industrial space has nearly doubled in Ulster County since 2010. And as I mentioned, the area is well served by existing transportation infrastructure and also highway access outside of the BOA. There's been some shifts in the job market. This data comes from the New York Department of Labor. The city of Kingston has about 1,000 fewer jobs than it did in 2019. That's jobs that are based here. So people could be working remotely and living here, but jobs that are based in the city have declined. And although the Hudson Valley has seen most of its job growth come from the education and healthcare sectors, the city of Kingston's actually seen a loss in both of those areas with fewer healthcare, about 1,000 fewer healthcare jobs and fewer education jobs. And the healthcare, we can speculate why that is. It probably has to do a little bit with consolidation of healthcare providers, and the education jobs probably has to do with the decline of enrollment in public school and the teachers retiring and not replacing those positions as they retire. There's also been loss in jobs in information, the finance and insurance, and the real estate and leasing sectors. Those are some of the higher paying industries, whereas there's been growth in construction, accommodation and food service, and public administration. All right, I'm going to hand it over to Elka, who's going to move on to talk more about the public engagement. Just to sort of summarize and wrap up, those were just a few of the key findings from our data analysis. This is sort of the quantitative data. And now we're going to really shift into our sort of qualitative input in our process around that. Okay. Hi. Wow, it's super echoey. Can you hear myself? Okay. Good evening. So as Kate mentioned, we're going to dive into the summary of engagement so far. For those of you who have been involved in planning processes before, it's hard to do a community engagement process that's comprehensive. You're always going to miss something. We are really trying to be intentional about how to expand the scope, and we're going to explain how we attempted to do that until this point and how we intend to do that moving forward. So first of all, we had a variety of activities, obviously public meetings. We did it, this is our third. We have attended a number of pre-existing community events, set up a table, got people to fill out surveys, had conversations with folks. On the top there, the photo on the top is at the Cinco de Mayo festival. And at the bottom, that's the walking tour that happened earlier in November. So we also did these small group discussions where we had groups come together at different locations that were identified kind of as key community hubs. It is so difficult to hear myself. Were you struggling with this? Hearing this like dual thing? Anyway, forgive me if I stumble on my words. It's because I'm and then of course there's the public survey. I imagine some of you have come in order to hear those public survey responses. So we're going to go through those as well. So first things first, we're going to share what we learned from the small group discussions, and then we're going to dive into the survey results. So the top needs, which may be expected, were affordable housing, which means housing that is actually affordable, not necessarily capital A, capital H affordable housing industry-wise, but really just the concern that housing has become out of reach for residents. Of course, associated fears of displacement. And included in that is not only the housing market, of course, there are also legacy businesses that folks mentioned. You know, they've seen some of their beloved restaurants or local spots close and move on. And as Kate noted in the data, of course, on the map, the food access is a real issue. And these we kind of put into the category of these basic material needs. And beyond that, there were concerns about places to gather, places to socialize, drug use and crime certainly came up as issues. Mental health support and services were directly related to those issues of drug use and crime. Of course, with the consolidation and the closure of certain mental health spaces. And one thing that really came up throughout this process, and you may have noticed that nobody in the room has taken advantage of Spanish speaking, the Spanish translation. There is a perception that these events are not necessarily for the Spanish speaking community. And as someone who does not speak Spanish, of course, it was difficult for me and my team to engage in those dialogues. And even in the survey responses, which you'll see soon, we did not receive enough. We did receive a bit, but not enough feedback from the Spanish speaking community. And that is something that across the board, we and the city are planning how to move forward and how to really make the effort to engage those communities more intensively. So we're going to dive into the public survey. Those were all kind of summaries of the conversations that we had in person and small groups. Midtown Thriving was selected as a pilot for the WIAT process, the Wellbeing Insights, Assets, and Trade-offs tool.
Our friends from the Full Frame Initiative are here today. Madge is going to come up and share a little bit about this process, but essentially what we did through this process was we had 6 community members as credible messengers. One of them is here today. Shtay, if you want to raise your hand. Yo. An organizational representative, Tilda's Kitchen. Chris Hewitt's here today. Oh, Sion, right. You walked in the door, right? I was Sion. Hi. Thank you. And we worked with this team of locals, of local community members, to design the survey, to implement the survey, to get the survey results. And we ended up with over 300 responses. It was a very lengthy survey. How many people here took it, by the way? So everyone, that's great. And in the open-ended comment section, we actually received 1,300 responses. Yesterday, we sat down for the entire day and reviewed every single one of them. And so the results you see here today are based on the review we did yesterday, so bear with us. Madge, I'd love to invite you up.
Thank you. As a complement to what already is existing in community engagement processes and governments that we've been able to partner with, WIAT is a tool that was developed to try to figure out how do we find out what matters to people about their well-being, and how do we do planning with that in mind and centered on well-being. So the only way to do that is to ask people. And so that's what the WIAT process allows us. It's based on our framework for well-being, which is really around these 5 domains that are listed there. They really are about relationships, about our predictability in life, safety, both emotional and physical safety, our ability to influence and have choice in what impacts our lives, and then our ability to meet our material needs. So those are those 5 domains that are listed there. And that's what the questions on the WIAT survey tool were really based on. So we plan through a well-being lens by finding out what people say matters to them. And if a decision is made about a project, how might that impact their well-being? What trade-offs will they have to make in their life in order to sustain what is decided about the physical environment that goes on? So that's why the questions in the survey that you all took really reflected that and asked you some of those questions you may not be used to answering. They really were about trying to find out about your well-being. We have a few aspects of WIAT that are unique in terms of community engagement. Really, a representation check, which is to look at all the people who are supposed to be in that area that are reflected in the census data. We want to match that so that we can say we have reached everyone in the community to tell us what they feel matters to them about their well-being, about this project. That's important to us. The other piece is that there's credible messengers involved, as Elka just described, from beginning to end, not at the end when a decision has been made, but helping to really inform how questions are asked. Where do we go to ask the people? Because they know the community, they know the area, they live and breathe in the areas that are in the project area. It's community ownership of data is another thing that's important. And that's really that we don't own the data. People have provided their information and feedback. We don't want to be extractive. It's really to be able to tell your own story about your community. That's part of WIAT and part of the information that's being shared. But all of that is really to understand what are the trade-offs and the assets, not just the things that people will have to give up, but what's important to them so that we don't undermine what's already working and take advantage and do more of that as we hear in the project decisions and inform the next steps of the phases. So we're not just interested in what people need, but what people already have and take advantage of that. So the movement part of WIAT is to really have a national effort about changing how planning goes in every city, in every part of our country, so that we start with what matters to community and not just build things that don't necessarily consider their well-being.
For those watching online, I'm just going to quickly ask if there is just a quick break. Is that, yeah, turn down the volume a tad? Because this is mostly for the online, right? Entirely for online? Okay, so if you turn down the volume, then they'll still hear me, and then I'll project, right? Yes? Good. Okay, thank you for your patience. Please hold. Yeah. Like, I think I'm more eloquent than I'm sounding right now. I'm just not sure. While Bartek is figuring that out, Shatea and Sion, as the two credible messengers here, are you interested in introducing yourselves, saying why it was important for you? Okay. Would you like to say a few words? All right. Here, I can bring you that.
No, not for you. Hello, I'm Shatea McComb. Since everyone took the survey, I am a lifelong resident here. You cannot have this right now. One of the reasons why I decided to be a credible messenger is because I believe I'm of age now to see and try to help what goes on in our community now here in the Midtown. I live here in the Midtown. I own a business here in the Midtown, and I'm trying to speak up for our youth because I believe a lot of the things that they're talking about as far as the Brownfield project and stuff goes, it's going to be the youth that has to deal with it later. So I would like to see and hear what their opinions are of what should be around in their neighborhoods and where they're at now, and hopefully help with some of the issues that they see as far as crime and giving them something to do to stay off the streets and do something productive. So that is why I became a credible messenger.
Thanks. Awesome. Good. And maybe Chris, do you want to share a bit about joining as an organizational partner?
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris at Tilda's Kitchen and Hudson Valley Current, and we worked with credible messengers at Tilda's, like Marta works at Tilda's, but she also helped spread the word in the Latino community. And I helped spread the word about the surveys without being a credible messenger, more of a credible organization that created a safe space for people to come and meet about the surveys and have parties or share food around the surveys. So it was just a pleasure to work with you, and thank you.
Likewise. I didn't ask Chris to talk so that he would toot our horn, but thanks anyway. All right, so we're going to go through, see if I can move this guy. Okay.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go through who we surveyed. So on the survey, for those of you who filled it out, at the end of the survey, there were a bunch of demographic questions. Some people did not want to answer these somewhat personal questions, but most did, which was really helpful for us to understand whether we had a representational sample of the community. So first of all, we did prioritize Black or African American and Hispanic Latino communities. We were pretty successful, thanks to our credible messengers, really, in reaching the Black community in Midtown. This is, I know that's really, it's probably very difficult to see this in the crowd, but this is essentially a comparison of the demographics of those who responded in the survey with the demographics in the census. And then basically in that comparison, we can see where we were successful in meeting the targets and where we fell short. So, and we compared those both to the demographic makeup in Midtown itself and the broader Kingston community. And the reason why we zoomed out to the broader Kingston community is because we did end up getting a pretty significant number of people who do not live in Midtown. I think it was probably about half-half. And so when you zoom out, you actually see that we did a good job. But when you zoom into Midtown, we obviously had a pretty significant lack in engaging with, again, the Spanish-speaking Hispanic Latino community. And what this data also shows us is that Midtown is a lot more diverse than the rest of Kingston. That's pretty much what this comparison shows. But again, we did meet, the green over here, that's plus or minus, I think, 3 or 4% in that comparison. So that shows you where we landed as far as race and ethnicity is concerned. We see results of household income. So when you look at the actual number of people on the left over here who responded, over a third responded in the category of less than $50,000 a year. But when you look at the comparison to the broader demographics, when we look at that representation check, there is actually a much larger ratio and a larger percentage of low-income residents in Midtown compared to who responded. So even though we did get, a good number, it still was not necessarily representational of the local community of Midtown. And again, sorry, that is household income. So that's not necessarily an individual income. It could be a 2-earner household, just so that it's clear. Age-wise, we did pretty well except for 18 to 29-year-olds. We did not receive enough feedback from that group. And we received too much feedback from millennials. But in other groups, we had a pretty good representational sample. Again, we've said this already, but we'll just show you in the numbers that this is the number of people who responded to the survey in English versus Spanish. That does not mean that the folks who responded in English don't also speak Spanish, but it does mean that they were bilingual. And there is a pretty significant number of people who speak only one language and not English that we most likely did not meet. I don't know, Chris, if you want to say a couple words about, because I know that Tildes did a lot of the outreach to the Spanish and Kikchi speaking communities. So if you wanted to share a couple of the insights that you shared with us about why it is we may have not seen that.
I think it's important that we sometimes question ourselves. We had a Latino night that was featuring an El Salvadorian menu, and one of my workers was sick and had to leave, and suddenly I didn't have the time to focus on the survey. So it was more of my fault than the community's fault of not having the support I needed to spread the survey that night. But throughout the week, we would give out English and Spanish surveys, and Bartek would come and refill both Spanish and English survey spot. But we were also lending out the tablets for people to fill it out digitally. I think what we learned is we could do a better job of marketing on our end as a partner organization, and just do a better job next time of reaching the community. I'm not sure how yet, but I think we could figure it out.
Thanks. Did you want to? Okay. Near the end of the presentation, we're going to share a little bit about what we intend to do moving forward in order to address this particular issue. We'll get there. So the first thing we wanted to look at is the vision statement. Do you all remember the vision, or that there was a vision on the survey? Yes, no, maybe. Would you like me to read this out loud? Okay, so I'm gonna not read it out loud. I was going to, but there aren't very many people in the back, so I don't think it's totally necessary. So we asked people, do you like this vision? Yes or no? Why or why not? So the good news is 92% of respondents said they like it. It's a pretty significant number. They liked that it was aspirational. They liked the focus on anti-displacement measures, the diversity of it. What they didn't necessarily like was that it was some people said it was too aspirational, that it was impractical, and there's absolutely no way this is ever going to happen. Interestingly enough, most of the skepticism came from respondents who identified their race as white, which is an interesting point. Couple quotes that indicated this. These were two of my favorites. If Kingston can figure this out, we will be a singular world leader. And my other favorite was, it's well-intentioned adolescent fantasy. What's that? How do you pick that? Yeah, it was a good one, right? Anyway, but again, generally speaking, the feedback was good. If skepticism is the worst we get, I think we're in good shape as far as the vision is concerned.
So just, I mean, maybe you're wondering like who cares about this vision? Why are we talking about the vision so much? And why was it on the survey? So as part of the BOA planning process, we're talking about the brownfield opportunity area. The first step is really to work with the community to create a vision, which then serves as a guide for all the other planning. So when we start doing concept plans and looking at individual sites, we reflect back on that vision and say, do these concept plans or do these recommendations for the neighborhood really help us achieve this vision? And what was not included in the survey, because the survey was already very long, is that going with that vision will be strategies and goals that directly relate and support that vision. So one of the criticisms of the vision was that it was, fantasy and not actionable, but in fact, it is our job now to think about how to make that actionable. So just to defend it a little bit, and our next step will be to read through again all of those comments about the vision and really think about what kind of edits we want to make to the vision to make sure that we're really responding to those, the serious concerns about it.
Can you just? Yeah, do you want me to advance? Okay, fine. Yeah, advance slides. Sure. Why not? I'm going to stand over here. I'll be Van Away. All right. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the next question on the survey was about what are the top 5 issues, areas of concerns that you have. Here's the list of what they were. Next slide. And we're going to show you the responses to this based on different demographic data. It's not enough to just look at the aggregate. One of the reasons why it's not enough to look at the aggregate is because we had an overwhelming number of white people respond and an overwhelming number of millennials. And therefore, we wanted to make sure that we have insights into who's saying what. And regardless of the numbers, obviously, having insights into what different communities are concerned about is really important. So, I was supposed to ask you, can you go back one slide? What do you think the top issue was? Any ideas? Just kidding. Go ahead. So, surprise, surprise, the cost of housing was the #1 issue for every single group. No matter who you are, you care about housing, you're concerned about housing. And then there was a little bit of variation by group. Interestingly, crime and activities for seniors both only appeared as kind of those top categories for folks who were, for elders in the community. And then for young people, employment opportunities and access to, you can't really see it very well, but these two, employment opportunities and access to transportation, were some of the highest ones for the younger age bracket. So this is by race. 90% of the Hispanic Latino community that responded selected housing. That was the highest percentage of all groups. If you look a little further down the line, you'll see access to parks and open spaces. That was a top concern, mostly for those who identified as white. Feeling welcome and treated with respect only popped up as a top category for the community that identified it as Black or African American. To me, that's a significant thing to notice. We talked about it at length yesterday, bit of a punch in the gut, and something that we as collectively as a community really need to address. And that's not to say, by the way, that parks and open space didn't rise as some category or some concern in other groups. But, you know, when you're concerned about some of these other really crucial, you know, safety issues, sometimes parks and open space just is not a priority. So this is based on income levels. And the outlier here really is crime only came up in the very low income category. I think these all kind of warrant questions with these different communities about why that is. Why is this data, you know, why are these trends, some are important to some groups, you know, what the survey does not tell us necessarily is why those specific groups. Although we did dig into those 1,300 comments, we're going to need to do a little bit more work in understanding why this is. Okay, this is a little bit hard to look at, but what we're seeing here is that the overwhelming response to the feeling about future development in you know, residential and commercial areas specifically, but more broadly, the overwhelming sense is a positive one. So the green represents a positive attitude towards that new development, or a sense of positivity about the ways that that development will impact an individual's life. The red represents a negative response, or a perception that it will have negative impacts on my life. And that middle bar in between, which is gray, if you look at the screen back there, that represents neutral. It won't impact me in this way. So what we're seeing is the most negative responses actually came from folks who identified as white. Hispanic, Latino, and Black responded mostly positively across the board. Some of the most neutral and least positive responses were lifelong residents. That's this bar over here. We speculate that that could be because when you're a lifelong resident, maybe you're older, this is not my first rodeo, we've seen the false promises, you know, there's a lot of, you know, I live my life, doesn't matter what goes on around me, you have a little bit more experience in that. I want to invite anyone from Full Frame to augment what I'm sharing, if you have anything that you think we should share. Good? Okay, thanks. As I said, this is all from yesterday. We all, the credible messengers, the consultant team, we all saw the data at the same time. So here we are. Okay, so I'm going to go through a little bit where there was agreement across all groups, no matter who you are, and where we saw differences between different groups. So you'll remember that Madge outlined those domains of well-being and the different fundamental needs that we have in order to have health and hope. And on the survey questions, you'll remember there was one that, how is this going to impact my, and then there was a list of things, and then you can choose, you know, from this is going to impact me very negatively all the way to neutral, and this is going to impact me very positively. And those questions were designed to address different aspects of well-being. And the responses indicated that people's sense of stability, which is kind of your ability to not be detrimentally impacted by change, right? You can stick to your routines, you can do your day-to-day life. They felt like new development might not impact that very much. They also felt that way about their sense of influence and hope. The most overwhelmingly positive impacts were in the domains of connectedness, and access to resources. So people felt that an influx of new development might actually help them socialize more, or they would have more access to, you know, maybe a grocery store, maybe this, maybe that. Again, depended on the type of development, but generally speaking, this was the vibe. The least neutral category, meaning you're either really positive about it or negative about it, was a sense of safety. And the folks who felt, again, it was mostly positive response, but we saw the most negative and less neutral in that category. And that was especially true amongst lifelong residents, so people who have lived here their entire lives, and millennials. As a millennial, I think it's because we're all depressed, but it's a different story. So the points of difference here, again, the least positive and most neutral overall were the folks who lived here their entire lives. We covered that. We noticed a lot of positivity amongst those who moved here between 2 and 5 years ago. So those are kind of the millennial transplants. Sorry, the pandemic transplants. The folks who moved here in the period before that, in the 5 years before that, were actually the most negative, felt the most negatively about the potential impacts of new development. The most positive overall were young people and folks who identified as Black or African American and Hispanic Latino. And white people were also the most negative group in those racial breakdowns. Still overwhelmingly positive, but those were significant differences about who was responding with a view of potentially negative impacts versus positive. Okay, hold on. Yeah, this is Diana from Full Frame Initiative.
Hi, I'm your data nerd for today, and I just want to make clear that when Elka's saying that it's overwhelmingly positive and that what we're looking at is the difference in the negatives, is that like the highest negatives among any subgroup was, I think, it was definitely less than 20%. I think it was maybe 16% or something. That was like, that would stick out as like a really high rate of a subgroup saying that they thought that would impact them negatively. Mostly the charts look like this, what you see in this overall, and it's sort of like what we're talking about, and the differences in the negatives are important, but I just want to make sure to give you a sense of scale for what that negative response is. We're probably most of the time talking like 3 to 5%, and then a high level that's like more in the low teens. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. I'm a millennial, so I was focusing on the negative, yeah. All right, so here we're going to get into some of the real good stuff. It's all good stuff, but this was really entertaining. Going through all of those comments, we sat there, we categorized them based on what kinds of concerns they were raising, etc. So these are all the questions we asked that had open-ended response, to give you a sense of what we were dealing with yesterday. And we're going to share the top themes that kind of rose to the top in every single one of those questions. Now, this is by far not an extensive list. And the rest of the results will be shared publicly. And Madge mentioned this, what's really unique about this process is that the community owns the data. So it's not like we keep it as the consultants and we just show you summaries. You will see the raw data, you'll be able to look at it yourself. So theme number 1 is housing done right and a fear of displacement. And we put these together because they were related. So first of all, we said this already, housing that is affordable, that helps prevent displacement. This was important for everyone, no matter who you are, no matter your race, no matter your income, etc. We had actually many responses from folks from the highest income bracket who were concerned about others who were going to be displaced. So it wasn't even necessarily a personal, I mean, it was also there were a lot of personal comments that I personally am afraid of being displaced, and I'm afraid my neighbors are going to be displaced. So this is a concern very broadly. And related to that is this tension between newcomers and newcoming uses, activities, etc. You know, who is the developer, whose interests are being served by new development. And the other piece that was interesting is a lot of people brought up all kinds of different housing models. So cooperative ownership, there were explicit mentions of multifamily ownership options, understanding, of course, that single family homes are very expensive, very much out of reach. So some quotes that illustrate that are as follows. Does anyone need these to be read out loud? So I'm just going to read this last one. As someone returning to the area post-college after coming back in hopes to utilize my degree for our community, that hope has slowly dissipated following the realization of the current housing market. I feel much of Kingston now represents the hopes of attracting new residents rather than working to better the lives of the current. And this is a 27-year-old white male making under $50,000. Here are another couple. Let me know when y'all are good to move on. Okay. All right, theme number 2, related local businesses. People have expressed to us that, again, a lot of their beloved community restaurants, places to hang out that were affordable, especially youth. We had a conversation with the group of Place Corps fellows, last year's fellows, and they were all talking about how, yeah, we used to be able to go to this deli or that place, and it was affordable to us, and now there isn't somewhere where we can hang out. And then, of course, jobs with decent wages that match the cost of living, a concern that is not unique to Midtown Kingston, but certainly stood out in the conversations we had. So here's some quotes that illustrate that. So here it's interesting, you know, you have these desire for a balance between the small local businesses and the larger corporations and organizations. And then you have, I very much do not want to see chain stores move in and knock out the beautiful local vibrancy. So I think there's this balance between how do we make sure that we bring in the kinds of businesses that have economy of scale, like a big supermarket that's affordable, without knocking out the key community assets, right? The meat market was identified as a supermarket that a lot of minority communities, well, majority communities use. But overall, you know, the sentiment that better economic prospects will ultimately supersede the negatives because people across the community are able to work, et cetera, that was a pretty predominant vibe as long as we protect what exists, right? The other thing is just more things to do. This was prominent for everybody across groups, especially prominent for youth. But again, everyone wanted more places to go. People lamented the loss of the bowling alley, the Dunkin' Donuts that left Midtown Kingston, you know, these kind of third spaces that people used to spend a lot of time at. And you'll see in these comments, it really, like, the respondents are it's a very diverse group of people who are saying the same kind of thing. And there was especially, I remember, a focus on free indoor community gathering spaces, not just outdoor public spaces. This was a really critical theme that kept coming up. and obviously related to housing, related to that fear of displacement, but it was kind of more this energy of local empowerment, uplifting the local personality, the spirit, building on what exists, like what Madge mentioned earlier, not only what do you want for future, but what do you have now and what's working for you, and how can we as the planning team help to protect those community assets? Let me know when we're good to move on. Does anybody need more time? No? Okay. So this principle of keeping things local is not only about it's not only about housing, it's not only about businesses. It's an overarching theme that really encompasses everything, every single part of this plan and community living. So the last theme that rose to the top was that overall people felt like this particular process was different from most planning processes, that the survey, even though it was really long, it actually was looking for a depth of input that most surveys don't ask for. And at the same time, the flip side of that was, it's great that you're doing all this work, but what happens next? How do we make sure that this type of engagement, these types of conversations actually continue? And this is a question actually that I think every single meeting we've had, people have asked, well, what happens next? How do we make sure, even if we like you guys, even if we like this project, how do we make sure that moving forward, our government will do what you're telling them that they should do? How do we make sure that these are actually going to come to fruition? Of course, the answer is that it's in your hands. And hopefully there's enough accountability built into this plan that it will help that, but certainly that was a pretty common theme. So that was a lot. Any questions?
There's a question on Zoom that I can ask. So how did you design the survey? And we thought about this a little bit. Do you think a better design survey could better reflect the neighborhood demographics?
I mean, you could try. Well, I think it's just a second. Okay, so there are a few things. So we designed the survey, first of all, we designed the survey based on, first of all, based on precedent and hours and hours and hours of research that the Full Frame Initiative put into it with a team of national data experts, nerds, other professionals. And so we had a lot of guidance from this national organization. But there were, of course, questions that we put in there that we felt were important to be in there. The entire team of credible messengers got together in order to help us phrase questions in ways that they felt were relevant for the local community. So it was in partnership with those community members who were involved as credible messengers. Do we think that a better designed survey would get more input? That I want to say not necessarily. I think surveys in general, I think as far as surveys go, we did get more diverse responses than most surveys I've ever done as a planner, and I've done many, many, many. I think not everybody has the time to fill out a survey. Not everybody believes that their input is going to be heard if they fill out a survey. There are also issues of literacy. So I don't necessarily think that a better designed survey would get
a more representational response. I think from our perspective, what's important is to diversify the types of input opportunities that we create and offer. So this isn't over. Let's just put it that way. I don't know if anybody from Full Frame wants to add. Okay. And then Match wants to say, oh, do you want
Just going to say that that's the reason we are a complement to community engagement activities already.
to hear for them?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to underscore that the reason why it exists as a complement to community engagement processes is because we know that a survey is not the end all be all for all of that. And I think what Elka said is really true, that there needs to be some other ways to do that. And there could be other questions that are added. So in a world that's ideal, we would probably get those in a grand scheme at some point, but I think we would still have the same sort of concerns in terms of not reaching every single community.
I mean, I'll add that I think one of the points of feedback we got on the survey was that it was a lot of reading and some of the questions felt very abstract. So because of where we are in the planning process, where we don't have specific sites with plans around that site that we were asking for feedback on, people were a little like, I don't know quite what I'm responding to. This is like development, new housing. Sure, it sounds good, but it wasn't the easiest thing to respond to. And we heard that specifically from Marielle Vos, Marielle with Lavos. That was actually feedback she gave us about the survey. So one of our next, as I mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, our next step in the planning process is to be looking at specific sites. And we will be Ilk and I are going to put our heads together around the community engagement around that, but that's going to be bringing people together for in-person sessions. And when we got the representation check on the survey and we realized that we were really underrepresenting certain groups, you know, we committed and we are committed to really reaching out to those groups in with strategies that are just going to be more successful than the survey was.
Yeah, I will say that in retrospect, I think we should have been more deliberate in hiring a larger number of Spanish-speaking credible messengers. So that is something that, in retrospect, I think we would have done differently. But moving forward, luckily, we still have, you know, up to almost a year left of this project, and we will certainly do that moving forward. I hope that satisfies the question of the person on Zoom. Okay, the question was, what is the next step after tonight? First of all, we all go on holiday. But the next, actually, Kate, do you want to respond about the?
So we, as Elka mentioned, we saw the survey results yesterday. So we are going to spend a lot more time with that and do analysis of those results. The first sort of thing that we need to get right is the vision. So really working and refining that. Parallel to that, Bartek and I have selected, I don't know what we're at, like 20 some sites, and we are currently waiting for responses from property owners to assess interest in participating in this process. A few of them are publicly owned, but not all of them. We have heard from a few property owners that they are interested. If property owners are not interested, we're not going to, you know, there's no point. And then the next sort of big phase next year is really focusing in on the concept plans for the sites. And parallel to that, since the plan will also serve as a master plan for the neighborhood, taking all the input that we have, all that data, which I just gave you a sampling of, honestly, because I wanted to leave more time for the survey results. And the survey results and synthesizing that into understanding what sort of recommendations and policy would make sense in this neighborhood to meet those needs. So that's what we'll be doing in the spring. And there will be more public meetings, many more community outreach events. Bartek and I did a walking tour, which We didn't get a great turnout, but I think it was a good tour. We're going to do a couple more of those. We're going to do site planning on the actual sites so that you sort of understand the context of the sites as we're thinking about what should go there. We have lots of things planned.
Hi. Just a question. You were talking before about after all this is done and how we're going to get things done afterwards. And is there going to be is it built into the process that there will be some energy that is going to keep this going, like after next year is over? Like now that we have all this, let's start carrying it out. Is that built into this process?
Okay, so I think the answer to that question is there's a few responses. So first of all, as far as the state grant, the goal is to have the neighborhood designated as a brownfield opportunity area. And then that opens up that neighborhood to tax incentives, to other state support for the redevelopment of those sites if they are brownfields. And even neighborhood wide, there's planning funding sources from the state to support planning in the community. It also makes any project in the neighborhood that is competing for state grants gets bumped up. So for example, New York Forward, or I don't know, there's a whole list of state grants that are competitive, low-income housing tax credits. If you're in a BOA, you get bumped up on the list. So that's one way that it will continue. The other is this is going to be a living document. I mean, it's not going to be a living document. It will be a document that is publicly available. And so as far as being a master plan, it's really up to the community to know that this document exists, that this is their master plan for the neighborhood, that all this community input went in, and the community should get behind and hold it up and say, this is our plan. And I'm going to let Bartek respond.
And then, yeah, as one of the city representatives here, I'd say, there are publicly owned sites in Midtown, in the Midtown BOA, and the outcome of this plan will have a direct impact on what happens to those sites. So I think that will be where you'll probably see the most tangible, immediate impact.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say about this is there are certain things that, there are multiple branches of government, right? There's the executive and there's the legislative. Those are the two primary branches of government that are relevant to implementing a plan. The executive branch kind of is the more project oriented, applying for grants, and the legislative is more broader policy that requires consensus amongst your elected officials. So for example, anything that's related to affordable housing requirements, affordability levels, tenant protection initiatives, all of those legislative initiatives require your elected officials to vote. And so the answer to your question in that regard is basically democratic participation is always important, even more so when there is desire to implement any recommendations in a neighborhood master plan, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but.
I mean, I'll add one thing. I mean, part of the planning process will be writing an implementation plan for the recommendations where we're really thinking through the recommendations we're making and who will be responsible. But again, once the project ends, we will, leave because our contract will be over. So it's not up, it'll be up to the community to sort of hold that up. But it is our intention to think through this at that stage. I don't know if that satisfies you. I still see a skeptical look.
I'm just wondering if part of your question is whether there's an ongoing plan, like a plan for ongoing community input opportunities, or is there like are they answering the question the way that you're meaning the question?
Well, basically, there could be an implementation plan and it could sit on the shelf. And I just wanted to know if built into this, that there is some person or agency or part of the city government or I don't know what, who is going to make sure that the momentum that was started with this maintains. And so like an economic development person might work to get a supermarket and that sort of thing, so that there's things actually happening that are not simply grassroots community stuff.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, I agree. I think, to the extent to which there's a department within the city that has oversight over some of the issues or what kind of influence, that, the city has over those issues. I mean, I'm very interested in making the plan a reality in all the ways it could be. And I think the rest of my colleagues would agree with me.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I mean, maybe there's a need within the plan to create a very specific recommendation to achieve what you're suggesting. And maybe there needs to be a person whose job title includes implementing the plan, and that's something that we can talk about. But that would have to, don't want to make promises at this point. Other questions?
Us, when they're gone, we're here. Oh, so the to answer your question, from my perspective, when they're gone, it's us, the people in this room that are here to stay on top of Bartek because he's in the room with us because he's the only one that's going to be here when they're gone. So if you want to see something continue, you don't get the mic. If you want to see something continue, then we just got to stay on top of it and then just ask questions now to get all the answers. So when they are gone a year from now, you're like, well, back there told us to hold you accountable. This is what we're doing, trying to hold you accountable. So it's me and you.
Yes. Is there a city planning master plan, and how do the results align with that if there is such a plan? So I think the question is, how does this relate to the comprehensive plan or other planning documents in the city? Yeah.
I mean, I think it relates in that the comprehensive plan led to the zoning update. And this is well timed with that because under the new zoning, as you're maybe aware, there's allowances for different uses and much greater density than there were previously. So this plan really sort of is a great follow-up to that. So that would be my response.
Next question is, how do we perhaps reconcile the validity of the results versus the demographics and where we fell short? And so do we think the results are still valid?
Yeah, so I think as it was presented this evening, when you view the results, you will be it's possible to sort the results based on different demographic groups. So if you want to know what one demographic group is thinking, you can easily sort the data to understand the results from that group. So because we fell short of meeting the representational check, the data will not be aggregated because we don't think it's valid in that form, but it's possible to say, well, this group thinks this and this group thinks that.
I want to say unequivocally, yes, the results are valid. Absolutely, yes. There was so much effort that went into this, not only on our part, but this national organization we were partnering with, 6 credible messengers, 1 local organization, absolutely unequivocally, yes. I don't think, again, I'll say this again, as a planner, I have never been involved in a project that even asked about demographics. And so if we're calling into question these results, we're calling into question every single survey that's ever been done ever that doesn't ask for demographic information. I think what the representation check allows us to do is to say we still need these questions answered by these specific communities that did not respond to the survey. So we will ensure that the communities that didn't necessarily respond to the written survey will still be answering those questions, right? So I hope that satisfies.
I'm just going to add to that that one of the things that's really neat when you look at the results of the survey is how much agreement there is across groups. So like, for example, the cost of housing really pops out. It's just like, it doesn't matter who you ask, that's the number one thing. And to be able to see it all broken down by every group and sort of go like, okay, and we've had any breakdowns that you'll see, they never include a group if there's fewer than 30 people in that group. So we're not including very, very small sample sizes. I mean, the 30s, you'd like to have more, but the subgroups are big enough that we are getting responses. So it's really neat to see how much agreement there is in your community about what the priorities need to be. And there are some important differences and you pay attention to those, but it's pretty cool.
I just wanted to answer the question. There is a comprehensive plan. It's called Kingston 2025. So it's supposed to be, it was 5 years ago and it's supposed to be reviewed in 5 years. And then the form-based code is the new zoning code, and that is very new. And that would be guiding, both of those would be guiding, especially the zoning has to guide what's happening. But just to kind of educate people about what the documents are, I think it's important. And I think they're both on Engage Kingston.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think technically, legally, actually, nothing that occurs can go against the city's comprehensive plan. So the comprehensive plan is an allowing document, and we're pretty sure that everything we will recommend and everything that's included in this plan will certainly align with the comprehensive plan. It informs what we do.
All right. Sorry, I was kind of late, but my question is, what area of Kingston is considered Midtown?
We can pull up the map. So we're going to pull up the map. There it is. So it extends to include the part of Broadway that we are in right now, and all the way up to that the entrance of the city, traffic circle, and north and south of Broadway, pretty much along that corridor.
All right, so from the traffic circle to here,
A little bit past here, all the way to the end of Broadway. So it's pretty much all of Broadway.
all the way down to Stewart.
Mm-hmm. To Delaware Avenue.
Okay.
So, and yeah, this isn't like an official
definition of Midtown. This is, some people define Midtown differently, but this is what we selected based on the fact that there's businesses here which are oftentimes sort of forgotten. So we kind of extended the boundary to include that. We wanted to include the Pine Street, the burial ground in the area, so we extended it this way. We wanted to include the entrance of the city because we thought it was important to think about the neighborhood and its sort of connectivity. So this is a boundary that we came up with as a planning team. This isn't like an official Midtown neighborhood. Yeah, there was input from our steering committee from.
Have a different definition of Midtown. If you're from Kingston, like growing up, anything past here going up is considered Midtown, and being young, me and Shatea, anything past the Y was considered uptown, and down by Stewart's is considered downtown. So if you're from Kingston, you hear Midtown, I'm not even thinking about the Stewart's downtown, to be honest with you, and I'm not thinking way up there by Domino's of that nature. If you're from the Kingston area, or you're born and raised here, so a lot of stuff you like saying like different names and stuff like that can confuse people from Kingston. Just a heads up.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had a few of those conversations and it's clear that those are distinctions. The reason why we extended these boundaries beyond what locals say Midtown proper is because we also heard that the connectivity between Midtown and Uptown or Midtown and Downtown and the Rondout, those connectivity pieces are a little, they're a little weak. Right. And so there's not a lot of cohesion as a city because of those pieces that kind of separate the areas. And so because one of the things this plan does is put the city in a position to apply for more funding, for, state support, for federal grants, well, state grants. If there's ever, for example, a connectivity thing, a transportation study, walkability, bikeability, any of that wants to connect Midtown to one of those different areas of the city, that will position the city to be able to financially support those connectivity pieces, even though they're not necessarily part of Midtown proper. Does that make sense?
I totally agree. I'm totally for upgrade. I'm just saying, speaking to people from Kingston, that they just get confused about different definitions, and sometimes they be like, "Oh, you're not talking about my area." Meanwhile, you talk about the area. Yeah.
So spread the word.
That people might not know the difference of.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions online or in the crowd?
No, we're good on that.
Okay, we're good online. Any other comments, questions? All right, so this is the first public meeting that is ever ending on time in the history of public meetings. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for those who were online. Oh, is there one more question? All right.
I want to commend everybody who's been involved with this project, with the depth and spectrum which people have covered with the survey. I found it very refreshing to see that the community is so interested in seeing what the community feels. And I feel that you folks did a great job. Well,
I would like to echo that sentiment. Out of the 1,300 comments, I think hundreds were kudos for your team. And I was happy that you separated out those kudos because it's important to take credit for your great work. So thank you.
And a huge thank you to all the credible messengers, Chate and Sion, who are here today, but all the ones at home, and to Chris at Tilda's Kitchen and the entire team at Tilda's. And thank you so much to the Full Frame Initiative for helping us create this super meaningful engagement tool. All right. Say anything? All right.
Okay, the song. That was it.